In July of 1945, the world was a rapidly changing place. Nazi Germany had handed over its official surrender just 2 months earlier, officially bringing World War II to a close in Europe. On the other side of the world, however, Imperial Japan was preparing for an apocalyptic showdown. Far from entertaining the idea of surrender, the Allied victory at Okinawa in June only clarified one thing. An invasion of the Japanese home islands would be catastrophically costly. The Japanese population, just as fanatically loyal to the emperor as the armed forces themselves, showed no signs of breaking. And in just 82 days of fighting on an island barely 70 miles long and no more than 20 miles wide, the United States suffered nearly 50,000 casualties. The Battle of Okinawa would directly push the Allies back to the drawing board. Operation Downfall, the official name for the invasion of Japanese mainland, was revised with the sobering casualty projections and level of Japanese determination witnessed on Okinawa taken into account. The invasion would be far more demanding than initially anticipated. Estimates now projected roughly 270,000 U.S. casualties in just the first phase alone. And that initial phase only called for the assault on the southernmost island of Kyushu. It was clear then a much larger assault force would be required, and with it a much heavier question. Was the United States leadership prepared to sacrifice that many young Americans in order to force Japan to submit? This was a central dilemma facing U.S. leadership, and one often highlighted in history books, but it wasn't the only one, nor was it an isolated question. The Imperial Japanese Army remained a formidable force on the Asian continent as a whole, fighting viciously against both Chinese communist and nationalist forces. Japanese troop strength in China alone numbered around 1 million men. If Operation Downfall was to proceed forward, it was imperative to pin down these Japanese soldiers on the Asian mainland, denying them the chance to ship back home and bolster home defenses in the face of an Allied invasion. Now, at the time, the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the United States CIA, was operating out of a base in Chongqing, China. With the growing military complications in the Pacific rising as U.S. leadership continued to weigh out their options, the director of the OSS, a man by the name of William Donovan, directed his staff, with the approval of the U.S. president, to look for allies and anyone willing to put up an effective resistance against the military of Imperial Japan. This was in order to bog down the vast pool of Japanese manpower on the Asian continent, further helping the broader Allied cause and directly impacting the potential of these forces being shipped back to Japan as a means of defense. This is where the Viet Minh first came under U.S. scrutiny as a real potential ally. And the Viet Minh was a liberation movement within the French colony of Indochina at the time. Their main goal was to achieve independence from France. It was initially created under their leader Ho Chi Minh in the early 1940s. However, during the course of World War II, the goals of the Viet Minh expanded beyond just French independence, but freedom from Japanese occupation as well. While their initial attempts to gain support from the local population was quite slow, the Great Famine of 1944 to 1945 did nothing but boost their popularity with the Vietnamese. The famine itself was caused by a mix of crop failures going back to 1943, French colonial policies that pushed peasants toward planting cash crops instead of stable food sources, and then Japanese exploitation of Indochina's natural resources. By the 1940s, both French and Japanese authorities were essentially diverting rice and forcing farmers to grow crops like jute instead of contributing to stable food sources, and thus the famine was created, killing an estimated 1 to 2 million Vietnamese and further fueling the hatred of the French and the Japanese occupiers. The Viet Minh appeared to be the only group willing to stand up to the French, or now more feared Japanese, with them even leading raiding parties on Japanese rice storage facilities and feeding the local population with the stolen rice. Militarily speaking, the Viet Minh appeared to be solid enough of a source of some kind of alliance, as Ho Chi Minh himself was no stranger to Americans. Association with Ho Chi Minh was believed to actually go as far back as 1942, when Viet Minh representatives approached the U.S. Embassy in China to request aid in freeing Ho Chi Minh from a Chinese nationalist prison after Chinese nationalist forces arrested him due to him not having proper identification paperwork and suspicion of him being a communist. Minh was later released and returned to Vietnam in September of 1943, which coincidentally a month later, a OSS memo proposed that the U.S. utilize the population of Vietnam through Ho Chi Minh to wage a guerrilla-style campaign in the jungles of Vietnam against Japan, with the U.S. encouraging them that if the Allies won the war, then Vietnamese independence would be secured, thus tying their sector of World War II to a personal struggle of independence. Boosting Vietnamese personal involvement within the war. Now, the initiative for the OSS appears to have never developed beyond this memo, but it's still important to highlight that as early as 1943, the U.S. had proposed an idea of at least incorporating Viet Minh and Ho Chi Minh into the broader Allied war effort. Despite it not developing further, Minh's relationship and perception with the U.S. only increased as time went on, though. In mid-1944, the OSS approached Ho Chi Minh to help organize an intelligence network in Indochina to help fight the Japanese and to help rescue downed American pilots that landed in Vietnam to then make their way back to the safety of Chinese air bases. And so naturally the question comes up that if the U.S. had already established an ally with Ho Chi Minh and they already had communicated with the Viet Minh through various moments and means throughout the course of the war, what was the problem? Why didn't they create some type of alliance with them before 1945? Well, the problem was the French. Even before World War II broke out, French-Vietnamese relationships were rocky at best. For decades, the area had been a hotbed of independence movements, with France cracking down hard on nationalist movements in 1930 to 1931, and again in 1940 to 1941. It's believed that Ho Chi Minh even famously attempted to approach U.S. President Woodrow Wilson during the Paris Peace Conference back in 1919 with the conclusion of World War I. It's believed the reason for which was that Minh simply wanted a bigger audience in understanding Vietnamese suffering under French colonial rule. Truth be told, however, the U.S. president was more focused on securing allies and stability in Europe over his view of seeing colonized people enjoy the same rights and equality as their nation's colonizers. The very notion that drew Ho Chi Minh to Woodrow Wilson in the United States to begin with. It's an interesting political side of everything that basically boils down to, since England and France had vast empires and many colonized nations all looking for their independence and looking at each other to see which nation would kick off their independence movements, and the U.S. understanding that them forcing the French or English to do anything within their colonies would then result in any sort of pushback with securing long-term alliances and thus undermining the stability of Europe. It was implied from that point forward that colonies were their main nation's concerns. Thus, that meant that the French colony of Indochina was that, as far as many nations, especially the U.S., was concerned, a French colony. And hence, it was a French problem. Even when Indochina was taken over by the Japanese, French authorities left in power by the Japanese were effectively working as double agents for the Allies. They would go on to share Japanese troop movements, assessments on shipments, and accurate details on weather reports. Their help in supplying all this information on the Japanese while saving face and claiming to be allies through the Vichy French government and thus Nazi Germany helped the Allied cause and thus negated any means of looking for help with the Vietnamese. It wasn't until the Japanese executed their Operation Migo in March of 1945. Japanese, wary of the French and declaring themselves realigned with the Allies as the U.S. closed in tighter on the Pacific and the English closed in on land via Burma, Operation Migo was launched to preemptively disarm the French, denying the Allies the opportunity of opening up another front within Vietnam. The bigger effect the Japanese had on doing all of this was that by disarming and arresting the French, Allied communication networks that had been established throughout the course of the war through the French, working as double agents, essentially collapsed overnight. Fully detailed Japanese troop movements, shipping traffic, and weather reports disappeared in the blink of an eye, creating this massive void of information on Imperial Japan within the region, a quite substantial region, as roughly 83 to 97,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians were stationed throughout French Indochina, far from an insignificant number. And so to cut through this fog of war and find ways to tie down Japanese forces in Indochina, Captain Archimedes Patty, who ran the OSS base in Kunming, China, would be the one to reach out to Ho Chi Minh. Now, this official request of some type of joint operation came in the form of him asking Minh for permission to insert an OSS team that would work alongside the Viet Minh. Ho reportedly was extremely eager to cooperate, supposedly greeting Patty's request with, "Welcome, my good friend." Now, yes, he would embrace the Americans with open arms, but he did have one specific request: to provide modern weapons to support their joint war effort. Naturally, Patty agreed. With a shake of a hand and a firmer understanding of this partnership moving forward, Patty got to work on organizing this OSS team while Minh returned to Vietnam. Minh would go on to set up a jungle training site at a place he named Tan Trao. It was a former hamlet of Kim Lung that now served as the Viet Minh headquarters. It was located roughly 124 miles or about 200 kilometers north of Hanoi, where he prepared for the Americans to arrive. Now, on paper, the OSS DEER team had been created back on May 16th and traveled from the United States to Kunming, where it sat there for another 2 months until it received final approval. During that time, the unit's makeup and leadership were finalized under Major Allison K. Thomas. Now, Patty had actually served with Thomas before, and he described him as a capable young officer, but one who didn't yet grasp full complexity of international power politics, and one who was there to essentially train guerrilla forces. He didn't have any political power or diplomatic backing. Once the green light came through, Thomas was briefed on his objectives and assigned his men. On July 30th, he was scheduled to parachute into Tan Trao, link up with a contact that Thomas simply knew as a Mr. Ho, and build a guerrilla force of roughly 50 to 100 fighters under Ho's command. Their job was to then attack and disrupt the rail line from Hanoi to Langsun to keep Japanese troops from moving into China and thus preventing them more from entering Japan. Thomas and his team were also tasked with spotting Japanese targets like bases and supply depots, passing whatever intelligence they gathered back to OSS handlers within China, and providing weather reports to support airdrops and U.S. Army Air Force missions whenever needed. Major Allison Thomas dropped in on the 1st of July 16th with 2 key team members as what was considered to be an initial wave. This 3-man team was Major Allison Thomas himself, First Sergeant William Zelsky, the radio operator, and then the team's interpreter, Private First Class Henry Prunier. On July 30th, about a week or so later, the rest of the DEER team would parachute into Tan Trao. These 3 men were Lieutenant Rene Defourneau, the team's assistant leader, Staff Sergeant Lawrence Vogt, the team's weapon expert, Sergeant Aaron Squires, the team's photographer, and finally Private First Class Paul Hoagland, the team's medic. Now, Defourneau had a very interesting experience throughout all of this. As you couldn't tell from his name, he was a French-born U.S. citizen. And out of this entire team, he actually had real field experience, having jumped into occupied France earlier in the war to work with the resistance against Nazi Germany before officially joining the OSS. When Defourneau hit the drop zone, the first man he would actually come to meet would be a Mr. Van. Mr. Van would turn out to be none other than General Vo Nguyen Giap, who, according to Defourneau, clearly ran things. Defourneau would actually come to believe that due to a mixture of Mr. Ho not really being around or as involved as Mr. Van was, and whenever Ho did appear, he himself didn't appear to be anything more than a sick old man. Reportedly, Ho Chi Minh was suffering from a severe case of dysentery, dengue fever, or hepatitis when OSS team arrived. It appeared that he was actually on his deathbed, expected to live only a matter of days, based off the team medic's assessment of Min's health. However, the more interesting bit was the dynamics between Giap and Defourneau. Out of the gate, the 2 men were suspicious of one another. For one, just as Giap took on the simple alias of Mr. Van, Defourneau has taken on an alias as well. Due to extreme hatred and prejudice of Frenchmen within the Viet Minh, it was decided beforehand Rene Defourneau's own personal safety demand he take on the name of a Raymond Douglas, essentially changing his whole backstory, claiming that he was the son of a Franco-American mother that lived in the United States for the majority of his whole life. Despite this cover story, both Giap and Ho would probe Defourneau's cover story relentlessly in an attempt to find some minor slip-up with Defourneau's cover story. Meanwhile, Defourneau would report to OSS leadership that Mr. Van and Mr. Ho appeared to not be on the same wavelength, believing Mr. Van was doing things independently from his boss. Of course, Defourneau was completely unaware that Mr. Van, Giap, was secretly running a private indoctrination school for young communists in the jungle. Giap's secret school for communism would come to be the least of the team's worries, however. As Thomas Allison continued to build a rapport with Mr. Ho and Mr. Van, he began to, as far as the OSS team members saw it, ignore his mission and neglect his own team. Reports from Thomas directed back to OSS leadership continuously painted Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh comrades in a positive light, with one of his reports even denouncing prior rumors of Ho Chi Minh being a communist, stating Ho's league was a combination of all political parties that simply stood for liberty, with no political ideas beyond Vietnam's independence. That was his sole concern, nothing more. In one of Thomas's reports, he would go on to say, Ho definitely tabooed the idea that the party was communistic. The peasants didn't know what the word communism or socialism meant, but they did understand liberty and independence. He noted that it was impossible for the French to stay, nor were they welcome since the Vietnamese hated them worse than the Japanese. Ho said he would welcome 1 million American soldiers to come to his country, but not a single Frenchman. By Thomas's own reports, it was clear Vietnamese animosity towards the French ran strong. D4New, on the other hand, became more and more wary of Giap and Min's friendly stance with Thomas, privately sharing within his personal journal that both Min and Giap have full control of their team's leader. Writing, "I stay with the boys and cannot help but hear their conversations. They hate him," referring to Thomas. "Personally, I hate him more and more every single day." D4New would even go on to express the laughable gullibility of Thomas, buying into the notion that both Min and Giap were agrarian farmers, blatantly ignoring their lack of knowledge on basic things, such as Min not knowing how to use a shovel or Giap not knowing how to even milk a cow. This growing distrust within Deer Team's leader and the intentions of the men they came here to help only grew as they had to wait over the course of a few weeks for their initial shipments of supplies to come in. Now, the first supply drops would come in early August. This consisted of American M1 rifles and M1 carbines. Subsequent shipments would go on to include far more substantial firepower, such as American-made M1 bazookas, motors, grenades, and machine guns. Since the Viet Minh consisted of no real military-trained personnel, Deer Team would immediately get to work in arms and weapons training, utilizing U.S. Army field manuals at the time as the core of the Viet Minh training, with a specific focus on guerrilla warfare and sabotaging techniques, as the Viet Minh were never considered to be a real fighting force, meant to engage in large open battles against the Imperial Japanese forces. Minh would come to embrace this joint training operation to the point of referring to the core trained Viet Minh as his Viet American Army, while the OSS team members commented on the efficiency the Vietnamese appeared to have with American weaponry and training. This positive turn in relationship between Deer Team and the Viet Minh wouldn't last that long, though. As luck would have it, before any official operations took place by this guerrilla-trained force against the Japanese, only the second week into their training, radio operator Sergeant William Zelski managed to pick up a radio broadcast officially announcing Japan's surrender on August 15th, following the deployment of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and August 9th, respectively. The surrender of Japan meant that Deer Team's mission was ultimately over. Under the terms of Japan's surrender, southern Indochina was to be placed under occupation of the British, while northern Vietnam was to see Chinese soldiers move in and disarm Japanese troops, while organized transportation for them to return home. Since Min's agreement with Archimedes Patty, all dropped weaponry was to stay with the Viet Minh. This was something neither Thomas nor any other OSS team members saw any reason to contest about. Unbeknownst to them, though, Min would issue an appeal to all Vietnamese to seize control of their nation before Allied troops arrived in Indochina, at which point he believed independence for Vietnam would be far too late or far too difficult to wrestle out of the vast amounts of Allied troops that had fled their country. Following Min's appeal, popular uprisings erupted in rural districts all across the Red River Delta, some incited directly by the Viet Minh, while others were a little more spontaneous. The core of the American-trained Viet Minh force would then go on to take over Hanoi, seize Hue, and force Bao Dai to abdicate. Bao Dai was the puppet ruler of Indochina placed in charge by the Japanese after executing Operation Migo. From here, the Viet Minh would establish a tenuous hold on Saigon, despite other nationalist factions doing their best to seize power for themselves in the south. As far as the remainder of Deer Team's time within Indochina was concerned, the American team broke camp on August 16th. They marched alongside Giap with his fighters towards Tay Nguyen. That was the nearby French provincial capital. Once there, Giap's guerrillas clashed with both French and Japanese forces until the French governor finally surrendered on August 25th. The Japanese, finally having learned their own government had capitulated, agreed to a truce the following day. Throughout the Battle of Tay Nguyen, Giap kept the Deer Team out of sight. He tucked them away in a safe house on the edge of town. While the Americans were staying safe and away from the fighting, Ho Chi Minh, back in Tan Trao, was preparing a major political gathering. Set on August 16th, this gathering would come to be known as the National People's Congress. Around 30 delegates from Vietnam, Thailand, and Laos converged on the village to air their grievances and chart a path forward. In the days that followed, with the future of the country still very much in doubt, as well as the surrounding nations, different factions jostled to take charge. In the end, Ho Chi Minh would emerge on top and was chosen as head of a new provisional government on August 27th. The Congress here would also come to select a new national anthem and adopt a brand new flag. The very same flag U.S. soldiers would come to recognize all too well 20 years later during the Vietnam War. A red field with a single gold star in the center.